Hello, my name is Ashley Rosenberg, and this is my group's World War II screencast on the causes, events, and results of the most gruesome war in history, World War II. My group includes Lauren Sibitzky, Bryce Stene, and myself. Our essential question is, who were the main leaders of the war? For starters, after World War I had ended and tension had erupted between the countries, Germany had absolutely destroyed everything and needed to pay for the damage that they had caused all the other countries during World War II, which led to the U.S. and France to have a meeting in 1919 to talk about how to fix this whole disaster. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at the time, proposed an idea of the 14-point plan in which he thought would help mend the wreckage between the countries. This plan was to have Germany be welcomed as a free country to trade and be able to strengthen its economy like other free countries. No expansions of territory were allowed, self-rule of independent people throughout the world was to occur, reduction of all weapons throughout Europe, and to form the League of Nations. This was an attempt to try and create peace in Europe. Unfortunately, though, a man named George Clemenceau had a different opinion and wanted to get revenge on Germany. Most people agreed with his ideas of having Germany pay its war debt. German colonies were to be divided and France to take control of all Germany's minerals. Germany must disarm and self-rule would only be granted to people that live within the areas controlled by the Central Powers. Germany, though, was very furious with George Clemenceau's proposal and had no intentions to sign the Treaty of Versailles, but had no choice but to sign the document. Signing the Treaty of Versailles seemed like the end of the world to the Germans. The German people were sick of their government and wanted change. No one had jobs, and food was very scarce throughout the country. Then a new public figure stepped up with the name of Adolf Hitler. He promised the German people a better life and to rip up the Treaty of Versailles. Everyone thought this idea was great, and Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. He began to build up Germany's military rapidly, making other countries feel unsettled. Little did they know this was just the beginning of Hitler's terror. In 1936, Hitler first attacked Rhineland, making allies with Japan and Italy. Then Hitler marched into Austria to take back the land that was taken away from the country. Hitler promised not to invade Czechoslovakia, but lied to take back more land. This wasn't enough, though. Then he decided to invade Poland. As each of these events took place, more and more of the war was beginning to develop. In 1937, a man named Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, was actually on Hitler's side. He thought that the Treaty of Versailles did treat Germany horribly and its conditions were extremely unfair. He thought if everyone listened to Hitler's commands, then maybe everything would go back to being at peace. This policy was called the policy of appeasement. In 1933, another appeasement developed called the Munich Agreement. This agreement agreed to have Sudetenland returned back to Germany, but no other expansion was allowed. Hitler gladly agreed and signed the document. Resultantly, though, Hitler, who was known as a chronic liar, ignored the new policy of the Munich Agreement and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. As for one of the last causes of World War II, the League of Nations was supposed to have developed. As stated before in Wilson's 14-point plan, he wanted to create the League of Nations, but this league had failed. The nations were to unite, and if to get into a disagreement, it would be settled by negotiation instead of fighting. During the 1920s, depression had hit worldwide. Families were starving, jobless, trade was reduced, and businesses lost income fast. Japan was destroyed by the Depression and saw the government was doing absolutely nothing, and started to look up to the army. Their army was invading Manchuria at the time in China. China didn't know what to do and asked for the League of Nations' help, but the army wouldn't leave. To get Japan to stop what they were doing, the League of Nations refused to trade with Japan anymore until they fled Manchuria. But Japan's response was to leave the League. Then, in 1935, Italy attacked the land of Abyssinia. They also called for the League of Nations' help, but nothing was resolved. The League to help create peace had failed because not all the countries wanted to join. They had no power, no army, and were able to act quickly to resolve the problems within the countries without fighting. Now to move on to the developments of the war. Here is a picture of the globe. This picture shows the main countries involved in World War II. The U.S., the UK, France, Italy, Poland, Germany, Russia, China, and Japan.
The causes for World War II are very clear and led to many developments of the war. As Ashley stated above that Germany had conquered most of Europe. Though Hitler's lying schemes, he conquered Poland, Czechoslovakia, Rhineland, Austria, and more countries. Since the Munich Agreement restricted access to Germany to expand and imperialize land, Hitler was furious and kept on going. The only country he left alone was England. As Hitler became more advanced with more power in the Nazi Party, people cheered him on. He bumped up from chancellor to now dictator of Germany. This was the perfect plan for him. Now he could finally spread his fascist ways. Hitler then drew up a plan in 1933 to exterminate the Jewish race. He wanted to cleanse the earth of the most races except Aryan, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and white-skinned people. The Jews were mostly Adolf Hitler's targets, along with the gypsies, mentally handicapped, and also older people who were weak. He created ghettos to round up the Jews to be able to control their huge population. German officers patrolled every movement of their lives. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to keep the Jews in line, and Hitler had better plans. He created concentration camps and shipped all of the Jews to the camps, taking away all of their prized possessions and leaving them with nothing. One of the largest and most common camps was Auschwitz. Here at these camps, Jews were treated as harshly. They lived in dirty buildings with no bathrooms and diseases everywhere. Starvation thrived through the concentration camps. Various ways to kill the Jews included gas chambers, shooting them to death, and getting them experimented on by psycho doctors. As a result, over 6 million Jews were exterminated during the time of 1933 to 1945. Since Germany was all-powerful and most countries were inferior, Hitler decided to strike again. This time, though, he invaded into Russia to try and keep the USSR quiet from telling of the Holocaust, and to create more living space for the Germans to have. Following this chain of events, in 1941, Japan bombed one of the United States naval bases in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, to be able to continue to conquer lands without having the U.S. interfering with their business. The naval base was destroyed and over 1,143 Americans were wounded and 2,335 were dead. The day following, the U.S. entered World War II and were ready to fight. In Asia, Japan took advantage of its power and kept on continuing to conquer large areas of Southeast Asia into interference. To fight back, the U.S. took over Pacific areas between 1942 and 1945. The fighting continued and the invasion of Normandy occurred in western France in 1944. European powers were sick of Hitler's rule and wanted to change. This day was organized to free the mainland of Europe from Nazi forces and take back everyone's freedom from Hitler's evil ways. Allied forces began to retake German-held lands and push the Germans eastward, causing more of a fight. Still, tensions began to climb between the United States and Japan. In 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to get revenge. Finally, though Japan had given up, the United States did much more damage than they had, and they had nothing to compete with. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan surrendered to the United States and the fighting was over. This day was known as VG Day. Next is Bryce with the results of the war. Here is an overview of the developments of the war.
Finally, the war was over, but the memory sure wasn't for all the fighters and people who were included in it. World War II was the most costly war ever fought in history. The loss of life and property in the war exceeded every other war in history. The total loss of life was around 50 to 70 million people due to all the conflicts that occurred. The leaders of this whole charade were the Allied leaders Joseph Stalin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and the Axis leaders were Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and Emperor Hirohito. Since so much damage was caused by the conquering of all the economics were absolutely destroyed in European nations, the state of the countries and of homes, businesses, factories were completely demolished and would have to be rebuilt in the future. Millions of people became refugees and were displaced. The United States economy soared more than World War I. This brought the Great Depression to an end. The U.S. also became the main military power. This made the U.S. world leaders more than it ever was before. The Soviet Union now also became one of the 2 leading superpowers. Unfortunately, though, the 2 countries eventually had issues with political and military problems which led to the Cold War. to happen between these two countries. Adolf Hitler supposedly captured and committed suicide, and many of these Nazi Party members were killed and put on trials for their crimes during the Holocaust. These trials were called Nuremberg trials, but most of them never resolved any of the crimes. The total of deaths in the Jewish population, as stated before, was over 6 million. It's said that 84 German generals were killed by Hitler during World War II. The Nazis murdered around 12 million people during the whole spree of the Holocaust, although Russia was the country with the most amount of deaths of 21 million. Since the fascist system of government had slowly disappeared from the deaths of its leaders, communism spread about Europe, Asia finally felt free and had a rise of nationalism and independence to spread their happiness. The atomic age had begun with the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. New developments came about from new technology of weapons during the war. More than 650,000 Jeeps were built during World War II. American factories also produced 300,000 military aircraft, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and 7 million rifles. In the end, strong effort to form lasting peace through international organizations was created. Another war like this to never happen again. It was obviously one of the wars to end all peace, just like Gandhi said. Here's an overview of the results of the war. Our group also included propaganda posters. The first poster shows how the Americans pictured the Japanese people as a racial insult. The second shows the U.S. encouragement poster to help recruit women into the war. The third is a poster of Uncle Sam telling troops not to share troop movements and tactics. The fourth also shows Uncle Sam recruiting troops to help win the war. And the last is another discriminating poster towards the Japanese. Thanks for listening to our screencast on World War II. Hope you enjoyed it.